Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Curious John. I got a little bit of feedback on last week's episode, all positive it seems like. You guys can tell me what you think. I mean, as you see this podcast progress, and I continue to stay on my path, the one I'm currently upriver on, you'll notice some of that energy ebb and flow, and I will try to temper my way in, and that's what I tried doing from the initial podcast, because that I have a lot of that type of energy, and so I don't want this to be overwhelming for those of you that don't and can't or don't want to empathize with that type of energy. But don't get it twisted, your boy's still here keeping that same energy. But anyways, I digress. I'll keep this podcast a little more lighthearted, as I am multitasking and I'm really trying to enjoy my weekend and have some legitimate downtime. I have been undertaking some projects and literally working around the clock, but whatever. Anyways, back on track. So, as I was preparing for this podcast, as I've mentioned a million times, I have a list of topics. Things that I eventually want to get to, things that are just sparks for a greater idea. But I often leave it to myself to go through my list, and I've talked about this a number of times, but I go through my list and I kind of gravitate towards something. And today, like, I really couldn't just attach myself to one of the topics. I couldn't really find myself speaking on these things fluidly or maybe even passionately, which is always the goal. So I thought I would try to do a little brain warm up, right? I often talk about wanting to do this podcast when I have a certain type of mindset that helps with the fluidity of my thoughts, but it also helps essentially make this a one take podcast. This isn't scripted, and this isn't something where I practice. It is often just one giant blurb of me just me word vomiting out my ideas into this podcast microphone. So I thought I'd try to kind of ramp up my brain a little bit. And in doing so, maybe hopefully it would get me into that quote unquote flow state that people always talk about. One way I thought I would attempt to do this was by using a quote. Shout out to my junior high teacher, Mr. Rosso. He is actually where I kind of developed my love for quotes. I remember he was our history teacher, among other things, because in those grades, one teacher does multiple things. And I do remember that he introduced me to also the Twilight Zone, which I have an affinity for, and then the old classic, by the way, not the new one for you kids that are way too young to know the original, because I was way too young to know the original. And he also had like a book of quotes that every once in a while you would just see him pop it open and read a quote, and it would prompt him to think something, right? And so I think that's initially where I picked up this little tip. In fact, just recently over Christmas, I gave out a book of quotes, just random miscellaneous quotes. You know who you are. And it was an attempt to just sometimes just give you something to think about. It's sometimes nice to be able to open something, take something that is the opposite of tangible, and mull it in your brain for a while. It gives you a mental exercise to kind of keep your mind sharp, or really give you the opportunity to think through different positions of an idea, to give you the addition to break down the idea, break down the words, reconstruct them in the brain, figure out what your meaning of that thing is, or maybe subconsciously the thing that you read will bring something to the forefront that will make you think a little deeper, or maybe really self-analyze some of the decisions or actions or your past or whatever. I mean, sometimes this can stem into a tremendous journey within your own brain. And I thought, heck, let's try it out. Let's see if this works. And I don't necessarily have my own book of quotes. You'd think I would have one if I gifted one, right? But one thing that came to mind was a quote I heard a long time ago. And so I'm going to be a terrible podcast host because I don't have the quote that I heard, but we're going to work through the idea of what the quote was about. And then this will also work as a twofer. This will work for you to kind of get a small glimpse at the way I approach problems, I approach ideas and mulling over things, so that just for the sheer purpose of understanding maybe the little bit of the way my brain works and the way I do things, but also maybe you'll realize that you do the same things, or maybe you do different things, or maybe I decide to go with this, you will kind of take something from it, whatever that may be. Because I'm a terrible podcast host, as I've mentioned a million times, I don't necessarily remember said quote. I just remember the basis and the initial idea behind the quote was something along the lines of like, men, also by the way, before I go into this quote, I thought it would also be fun to get your feedback, because this isn't a fleshed out idea. This isn't work. This isn't ownership. This isn't, more. This isn't these diamond podcasts I always allude to. This is more of like, let's work through this together. And so I thought this would be fun also to maybe get your feedback on what your thoughts of this quote is, and your feedback on, from a male or female standpoint, whether or not this is true. So back to the podcast. So the quote was basically saying something along the lines of like, men in general, yes, they want love from their partner and their peers and society, but overall, God, I really wish I had this quote. Overall, men, while they do want love and affection, some men want respect far more than they want any of those things. And I can't remember if the quote essentially alluded to the fact that all men want that more than they want love. And once again, we're speaking in tremendous generalities here, because we're not speaking things as they are facts. We're speaking in just general thought as to how the most percentages of men would approach this. And as I heard that, like initially I thought like, well, that's a whole bunch of shit, right? Like, of course men want love. Like they want their partners to love them. They want their kids to love them. But when really giving this further thought, I almost have to agree with it. And my thought on this is this. Love is important, but I think for men, because of the way men are wired, there is a deep-rooted like tie between the two. Like in men's mind, it's almost, at least I'm probably talking for myself here, to be honest with you. In men's mind, like love and respect is somewhat tied, because you don't necessarily, I don't feel like you can love someone without giving them respect, and vice versa. Right? You have to respect the person you love, I would hope, and you would also have to love that person, which in theory should give you respect. And so I was thinking about this from a greater society level, where maybe from your loved ones you would want both, right? But from a society level, you likely don't want love. I mean, at least I don't. I don't really give a shit what Joe Blow down the street thinks of me. But for sure, respect is on that list, right? So if we're talking about the greater generality, and we're not talking about like your immediate partner in life, you're likely thinking of everybody in society, your teachers, your peers at work, your bosses, your tax guy or girl, the person that cleans your house or tends to your yard or whatever. Like these people, you don't necessarily need love from them, at least in my opinion, but you definitely need respect. And the reason why this was such an interesting concept was because as I think about it further, I think respect is really tied to a man's like self-worth. We often, as men, sometimes look down on other men who are, I'm sorry, but for lack of a better word, like super whipped on a girl, right? You look down on those men because in another man, quote unquote, another peer, you're seeing that man be weak to that woman. And there is an internal primal nature in men that has to come to the realization that if you are too submissive, too weak, too passive to a woman, they do lose a certain amount of respect to you. You see these women that like don't respect men, and you see these women that often talk about like, well, he's such a nice guy, but I feel like I would just walk all over him. That's a dangerous proposition. You hear these women all the time that date the nice guys, and the nice guys always lose. And you hear these guys that date these girls, and these girls are always just like, oh, I just felt like I'd walk all over him, or he was just too nice. Oh, I needed somebody that just maybe had a little bit more edge to them. And I think, once again, speaking in generalities, I think for some women, they correlate the attitude, the bad boy, the tough guy, whatever. They looked at it. They look at that as a challenge, but also somewhat more of an equal than the super nice guy who they can walk all over. But I digress. The point of this is saying that it's fascinating because those situations, those instances happen all the time. And in doing so, you're stuck in a weird spot because when a woman, in my opinion, loses respect for you, that is a tremendous endeavor to try to rectify. You're not going to often get that back. Because when a woman looks at you like, for lack of a better phrase, not a man, that's a difficult concept. And for a man, that's almost removing his maleness, if you will. And that comes with a lack of just respect. She's not respecting him as what he is. She's saying he's less than what he should be. And that's a tough one. And gosh, I mean, as I'm saying that, it's so fascinating because I don't know if women get that. Like, I don't understand if women do. And I would love to get both male and female viewpoints on this because it is a very interesting concept. And it's a concept worth fleshing out when it comes to the dynamic of dating and marriage as a whole. As you mull over these concepts in your head, I kind of want you to kind of think about this from a few different viewpoints. One of which is your male viewpoint if you are a male. From a female standpoint, whether or not this makes sense to you, considering you're female and considering your like the way you function in life, and then also as a female, like how this does or doesn't apply to your partnerships and or partner. It's a fascinating concept, and while I'm still mulling it over, and I don't want to spend too much of your time today considering this thing that's really just not incredibly important, but maybe useful for some of you who are dating and who, well, those of you that are dating, married, have kids of your own, maybe some of you that are dealing with partners that maybe you've never considered these concepts as to how you approach them and how you talk to them. I mean, this might be useful for you. That's why it's worth mulling it over. But I don't know. I'm still thinking about it myself, and I wanted to keep this one short this week because I'm still multitasking. But let me know what you think about that. I'm really, really curious, especially from just a female standpoint and then also the male standpoint. Whether from a male you agree, disagree, whether from a female you see it or don't see it, and or your view on this as a woman. Send your feedback over to me, LifeGeneralist on Instagram. I don't want to have another Instagram just for this podcast. But that's it, ladies and gentlemen. Today is just a quick little mental exercise, just something to kind of keep you moving on this Monday morning, this Martin Luther King Monday morning. And hopefully this gives you a little bit of mind exercise to stretch your brain a little bit. And we'll be back next week. Well, how about this? Let's play a game. Let me know, apart from the feedback on this podcast, let me know what you want to see more of. Are you looking more for this intense version of me that you got last week? Are you looking for more introspective items, thought exercises like today? Are you looking more for, stories from my past and lessons learned? What are you looking for? Send me a DM. Put a comment on the post on my Instagram. Whatever you want. Get a hold of me. I read everything. Talk to you guys next week.